Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me all right in the back? Good. Like Andrew mentioned, I'm David Fox. I'm the fuel specialist on the West Fork. Thanks for having me here today. I've been asked to kind of talk a little bit about the fire history on the West Fork within the Frank and Selway Bitterroot Wilderness areas, and kind of talk a little bit about our decision process for managing fire. And then I'll kind of end the talk with a little recap of last year's fire season and kind of some of the fire effects that we saw from those burns. And hopefully we'll get to visit some of those sites here in the next couple days, or tomorrow, I guess. So if you just want to click through. This picture here is the Indian Ridge fire from last year. And that's something I'll show as we progress through the slideshow. So just to, Sean kind of hit on a few of these things, but just to kind of give a broad overview of the West Fork. So we manage a portion of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness and a portion of the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. The Selway Wilderness was designated in 1964 when the Wilderness Act was signed. It's roughly 1.3 million acres in size, with 81% being in Idaho and 19% in Montana. The Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest and Bitterroot jointly manage that wilderness area. On the Bitterroot, we have just over 500,000 acres of the Selway Bitterroot. And the West Fork, we have a big chunk of that, so just over 300,000 acres. As Andrew mentioned, the Bad Luck Fire was kind of the test case for wilderness fire management back in 1972. And so the West Fork is kind of the birthplace of wilderness fire and has a long 50-year tradition of managing wilderness fire. The Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness was designated in 1980. It's just under 2.4 million acres. And it's jointly managed by 4 national forests: the Salmon Chalice, Payette, Nez Perce Clearwater, and Bitterroot. And the West Fork has a pretty small chunk, just under 200,000 acres. The Magruder Corridor Road runs basically through the wilderness, and it bisects the Selway, Bitterroot, and the Frank Church. So everything north of that corridor, which was built by the CCC in the 30s, is the Selway. And everything south of there is the Frank Church. And Magruder is kind of right in the middle where we're going to be the next couple days. It sits pretty much right in the middle. So south of there is the Frank and north is the Selway. Okay. I don't know how this displays for the folks probably in the back. There's a few of these hanging up on the walls around the room. But this is kind of a fire history map of the West Fork Ranger District from 1972 to 2002, so 50 years. This is something I kind of keep updated annually. For the purpose of this workshop, I added in some of those early years, the 1970 to 1994. There wasn't huge acreages burned during that period, but again, I feel like it's pretty relevant to this conversation as far as the initial building of the Wilderness Fire Program. So you can see on this map, there's a lot of burn that has happened in the last 50 years, and more so even in the last 25 years. Really since 1994, 96, some pretty sizable areas have had fire out there. And so the color scheme, just kind of the red and some of this black area are the more recent fires, and then it kind of cools. The color scheme cools as it gets older in time. And then you can even see down onto the Salmon Chalice, large areas of burn, mostly from the Mustang fire in 2012. Okay, next slide. So here's some statistics of fire history within the wilderness on the West Fork. So you can see starting back here in 1970, by decade, the acres burned within the wilderness on the West Fork. And so it started out pretty small. There were only a few relatively small fires in the 70s as they were building that program, and it slowly started ramping up. Like I said, 1996 was kind of a turning point out there as far as acres burned. There's the Sweat Warrior fire in 1996 ended up burning about 40,000 acres. So that was kind of the first one that had a fairly large footprint. And then 2000 and 2010, those were some pretty big decades as far as areas burned. And then 2020, we're only 3 years into that decade, and it's a little bit skewed because 2020 was also a unique year with COVID in that we weren't allowed to manage any fires that year. So any ignitions we had in 2020 were to be suppressed. Over on the right is just a finer detail of fires or acres by year. And so you can see kind of some years of note. 1986 had a decent amount of acres burned, just under 20,000. 96 was over 40. 2000 bumped up to 60,000 acres. And then really the outlier is 2012. So that was a huge fire year for the Frank and the West Fork. I think that year alone we burned about 120,000 acres on the West Fork out in the wilderness. And then the Mustang fire just to the south was over a 300,000 acre fire. So lots of fire that year. And then it kind of has tapered off since. 2013 was Gold Pan fire, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And then we kind of had some lean years there. And some of that is decision making, and some of that is also, I think, what Sean alluded to, the effect of large areas being burned and not getting as many ignitions as we historically were. We've seen our fire starts on the West Fork go from 40-something per year down to some of these last few years in the teens. And so we're just not getting the ignitions that historically were happening before a lot of these areas burned. Okay, next slide. So this is a little bit more detail on the fire history. So within the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness area on the West Fork, there's 300,000 acres. A total of 182,000 acres have burned since 1972. Of that, there's 146,000 acre footprint. So roughly 48% of the Selway has experienced some fire in the last 50 years. And roughly 68,000 of those acres have burned multiple times. So 22% of the Selway has had multiple fire events, maybe even 3 fire events on the same acre, including some of the fires we managed last year. And where we're going to go on one of the field trips, you'll see an area that has burned 3 times, 1996, 2013, and then again in 2022. So what's that, a 17 and a 9-year interval? And that's kind of typical of more of that warm, dry site where it would have had more of a frequent return. In the Frank, like I said, we managed just under 200,000 acres. Within the Frank wilderness, there's been 276,000 acres of cumulative fire in the last 50 years. The footprint of that is just under 165,000 acres. So 84% of the ground the West Fork manages within the Frank has had fire on it in the last 50 years. And within that 82,000, or roughly 42%, has had multiple fire events on those acres. So again, a fair amount of fire out there, and we're starting to get where acres are burning multiple times, and we're getting re-entries and depending on the site, trying to maintain that fire return interval. So just to kind of summarize, cumulatively in the last 50 years within the wilderness, there's been over 300,000 acres of wilderness fire, and roughly 62% of the West Fork wilderness had fire in it. Okay. Again, I apologize. It's probably hard to see, but basically what I did here is I took the fire history map and I overlaid where we've had multiple fire events. So any of the kind of the grayer color there is areas that have had multiple fires. And so you can see a lot of it is down in this Frank country. This is the Salmon River corridor way down here. The district goes all the way down to the river. This is about the dividing line between the Frank and the Selway, and the Selway's to the north. For a lot of years, the Selway just wasn't getting the starts, or when we got the starts, they just weren't burning as big. But in more recent years, we're actually seeing some more larger fire growth in the Selway wilderness, and that's really the last kind of area of pockets of unburned out there. As you can see, the Frank is pretty well filled in, short of a few little holes down there by Sweat Lake. Okay, next slide. So that's kind of a recap of the fire history on the West Fork. So 2013 was kind of a year where we had some, I wouldn't say issues, but it was a unique year with the Gold Pan fire. That was a fire that was managed. It started in mid-July, and by September it had multiple Type 1 teams, Type 2 team on it. We spent $12 million on the fire because of maybe an underestimation of the fire activity and the potential. And that fire actually came out of the wilderness into the Blue Joint drainage and was threatening the West Fork community. And so we spent a fair amount of money trying to prevent that fire from impacting the community. One of the things we took as a district, because of that strained some relationships with the community. We had pretty good working relationship prior to that as far as managing fire back there. And so there was a strain after that with our locals. And so we had gotten to a point where pretty much every fire was just decided to be managed. Like regardless of time of year, conditions, if it was in the wilderness, it was allowed to burn. And so we thought there probably needed to be a little bit more of a risk-based management approach to at least evaluating starts to determine what the potential risk was for those fires. And so the FMO at the time, myself, we kind of sat down and figured out a relatively quick process where we could kind of do an initial screen when we got a smoke report on, is this a fire that is a low risk, moderate risk, or high risk? And allowed us to explain to the line officer the potential impacts that fire could have. And so this is right out of WFDS, for those of you that are familiar with WFDS, but basically it's the relative risk assessment. There's essentially three main parts to it, and each part has three subparts. But as a duty officer, basically when we get a smoke report, we will go through and fill out the threat to values, threat to cultural and natural resource values, social and economic concerns, cross those lines, get a risk rating for that. We'll go through the fire behavior section as far as potential fire growth, what type of fire behavior or effects we're expecting, what the fuel conditions are at the time. And then look at the barriers to spread, time of season, and seasonal severity. And so you fill out all those individually, and then cumulatively you cross the lines on probability, hazards, and values. And that kind of gives you a low, moderate, and high relative risk rating. So we take that, and then if you can go to the next slide. And then in our dispatch office, we track this every day, but this is our ERC chart. So this is where we kind of stay apprised of what our current conditions are out on the ground as far as fuels and the potential for fire activity. And so we kind of really came down to, for us, it's the risk, but then it's also the time of season. So the earlier in the year you manage a fire, that's longer duration, more burn windows, more chances that fire could be exposed to rare weather events or long duration peak burning. And so we kind of broke it down, looking at the ERC chart. We took the peak of the fire season, and we said before that, really, it probably needs to be a low risk incident for us to feel like that's not going to have impacts or for it to have potential to leave the wilderness area. Because ultimately that's part of our forest plan is to evaluate the potential for the fire to impact adjacent management areas. Then in the middle of the season, so kind of where the ERC average line peaks to where it kind of flattens off a little bit here in August. So we said in that time period, that would be when we would consider bringing in moderate risk fires. Because again, you're getting a little bit later in the season. We wanted to provide opportunity to still manage those fires, but there's less risk with taking those on in August versus June or early July. And then we kind of looked at where the average line really started to fall off. So where you're starting to move towards the tail end of the season. And so that was right at the beginning of September. And so that's where we would consider taking on more of those high risk incidents, ones that are closer to the edge of the wilderness in areas that are maybe haven't had previous fire scars with large contiguous areas of unburned forest. And so the duty officer could basically take this information and in 5 or 10 minutes evaluate a fire ignition and make kind of an informed risk recommendation to the line officer. Now this is just a discussion, a starting point. It's ultimately still the line officer's decision to manage the fire or not, but we felt like this was a way to kind of eliminate some of those fires that may cause negative outcomes due to unforeseen weather events or, again, just having fire on the landscape for 3 or 4 months. Okay. So that's kind of our process. Again, we've used that probably since 2014 after Gold Pan. Now I'm just going to talk a little bit about last year's fire season. So on the West Fork last year, within the Selway and the Frank, we had 16 total ignitions. Within the wilderness, we managed 14 of those. The 2 that were suppressed were right on the border of the wilderness. So again, likely to leave the designated wilderness area. And it was earlier in the season. We managed fire between July 7th and October 21st, so almost 4 months of fire on the ground. Total, we got just under 19,000 acres of wilderness fire footprint out there. They ranged in size from 1/10 of an acre to about 9,500 acres. We had 3 or 4 that started in old burns that just went out. They never even survived. The mean fire size for those 14 fires was just over 2,000 acres. And just based on the proximity of where these fires were last year, we had a pretty extensive point protection effort throughout the whole summer. Pretty much almost every value that we have out in the wilderness, such as lookouts, cabins, bridges, were pretty much threatened by most of these fires last year, just the way they were spatially spread out across the wilderness. So we had point protection on a lot of stuff, and it required not a lot of resources, but a continued commitment of resources pretty much from the end of July all the way till probably the end of September. On the right here, it's kind of a before and after picture. So on the top, that's the Indian Ridge Fire, probably a few weeks after it started. Really just textbook underburn in open ponderosa pine forest that had already had previous fire in 2012. Really, it was such low surface fuels, it was just picturesque fire, basic ground fire. And then you can kind of see, it's probably tough from back there, but this picture below is from the same vantage point this last weekend. So you can kind of see what it looks like already. It's greened up. In the background, you can kind of see some more of the mixed severity fire effects on the north slopes there. And that's the Indian Creek drainage. Next slide. So yeah, just to kind of recap, of all the acres that burned last year, 7,600 acres, or 47% of those acres, burned at low severity. And this is based on satellite burned area severity mapping. 6,500 acres, or 41%, were moderate severity fire effects. And then about 12% of the area burned was high severity. And I've just provided a few examples here of fire effects on some of the different fires we had last year. So again, Indian Ridge, more south aspect, open ponderosa pine that had already previously burned about a decade prior. You can see very, very low fire effects, and it's already greening up and really lush in there. But also in Indian Ridge, we had some more mixed severity, kind of on those north aspects where fire had the fuel continuity and slope alignment to make some uphill runs. Cayuse, down in your bottom right, the far right one is an aerial view from the helicopter, kind of after we'd gotten some fall weather. That fire is one that pretty much burned an area that had burned twice before. So there was lots of dead and down fuel from previous mortality. And what we saw in there is it cleaned up a fair amount of that, and it also knocked back a lot of that lodgepole regen that was coming in after the fire. And you can see in the bottom middle there, that's some of the up close fire effects. So killing regen, but not entirely consuming all the downfall. And then on the bottom left is the twist fire. So that one was a higher elevation fire out by Horse Heaven Cabin, almost out to the border with the Red River Ranger District. And that's a fire where we got probably more high severity effects because of the fuel type up there. It's higher elevation. It got up and moved through the crowns with kind of some wind one day and made a sizable push. But then it also burned into some fire that had burned in 1998, and that's where we saw more of the ground fuels almost entirely consumed, even up in that higher elevation. Okay, I think that's mostly what I have. I don't know if there's time for questions or if anyone has any questions.
One question. We have about a minute and a half left. The one I had, you had the wolfness charts, the risk assessment part of it, and then you went to the special interest group ERC chart, and you had low, moderate, high. And I think you answered the question, but that's not necessarily a formalized process that's documented. It's just more of a best management practice. You still said the line officer had discretion based off where you land, low, moderate, high. It's not necessarily that you documented that anywhere in a management plan, that you use that process. You know what I'm asking?
Yeah, so that isn't like a forest plan requirement or fire management plan requirement. It's basically a process that we use locally on the district to help make decisions or recommend decisions to the line officer. But yeah, we went through a fire management review from the region probably 4 or 5 years ago and presented that to them at the time, and they really liked it. But yeah, it's nothing official.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.